Picture this. You've spent 14 hours preparing a feast that could feed an army. Your back aches from standing over hot stoves since dawn. Your hands are stained from peeling potatoes, and your heart is breaking as you sit alone on a wobbly folding chair in the corner of someone else's kitchen. The sounds of laughter and clinking glasses echo from the dining room where your own family sits, praising someone else for the meal you created with your own 2 hands. You're invisible, forgotten, treated like the hired help in a home where you should belong. That was me, 3 years ago, staring at a plate of food I'd lovingly prepared but couldn't even enjoy because I wasn't welcome at the table I'd helped set. My 10-year-old son kept stealing glances at me through the doorway, his young face flushed, with an anger I'd never seen before. The injustice was so clear to him, so black and white in the way only a child can see the world. Adults complicate things with politeness and keeping peace, but children see truth. And my son Lucas was about to speak a truth that would shatter everything we thought we knew about family, loyalty, and the price of keeping quiet. He stood up from the children's table where he'd been relegated, despite being old enough to sit with the adults, cleared his throat with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what needed to be said, and announced in a voice that carried through both rooms. Before anyone says what they're grateful for, I think everyone should know who actually cooked every single thing on this table. The dining room fell silent like someone had pressed a mute button on our entire lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and I need to tell you about the Thanksgiving that changed everything, the day my son became my hero, and the moment I finally learned what I was truly worth. I'm 34 years old, a school administrator from Cedar Falls, Iowa, and for the longest time, I thought being accommodating meant being loved. I thought putting everyone else's comfort before my own was what good wives and daughters-in-law did. I thought my voice mattered less than everyone else's peace of mind. Growing up as the youngest of 4 daughters in a tight-knit Mexican-American family, I learned early that harmony was precious, that rocking the boat was selfish, that a woman's job was to make everyone else comfortable even if it meant swallowing your own needs. My mother, God rest her soul, was the queen of this philosophy. She'd work herself to exhaustion during holidays, never complaining, always smiling, always saying it was her pleasure to serve. I admired that about her, but somewhere along the way, I confused servitude with love. Cedar Falls is one of those towns where everyone knows everyone, where your reputation follows you from elementary school through your golden years, where family names carry weight and keeping up appearances matters more than keeping your sanity. It's beautiful in the fall, with tree-lined streets and that small-town charm people write songs about, but it can also be suffocating when you're drowning in expectations and no one seems to notice you're going under. I work at Jefferson Elementary as an administrator, managing budgets, coordinating with teachers, dealing with parents, handling crises both big and small. At work, I'm respected, valued, listened to. Teachers come to me for advice, parents trust my judgment, and the principal relies on my expertise. I make decisions that affect hundreds of students and families, and I'm good at what I do. Really, good. But the moment I walked into my in-laws' house, I transformed into someone I barely recognized. Someone small and apologetic, and desperate for approval that never seemed to come. My son Lucas is everything bright and beautiful in this world. At 10 years old, he has his father's green eyes and my stubborn streak, though I never saw it as stubborn until that Thanksgiving. He's the kind of kid who notices everything, who asks questions that make adults uncomfortable because they're too honest, too direct. He loves soccer and science experiments and has this way of making me laugh even on my worst days. Lucas has always been protective of me in that sweet way children are with their mothers. But what he did that day went beyond childhood protectiveness. It was pure courage. My husband Michael and I met during my senior year at the University of Northern Iowa. He was charming in that quiet, steady way that made you feel safe, like he'd always be there to catch you if you fell. He wasn't the loudest guy in the room or the most obviously attractive, but he had this reliability that drew me in. He seemed different from the boys I'd dated before, more mature, more grounded. When he talked about his family, he painted pictures of Sunday dinners and holiday traditions that sounded like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Michael worked in his family's insurance business, the kind of generational company that had deep roots in the community. The Thompsons had been in Cedar Falls for 4 generations, and their name was on half the buildings downtown. They were respected, established, the kind of family people looked up to. When Michael proposed after 2 years of dating, I thought, I was marrying into not just a relationship, but a legacy, a place where I'd finally belong completely. His mother, Patricia Thompson, was a force of nature in the best possible way, at least at first. She was the president of the garden club, organized charity drives, hosted elaborate dinner parties, and seemed to know everyone worth knowing in 3 counties. She had this way of making you feel special when she focused her attention on you, like you were the most interesting person in the room. When Michael first brought me home, she welcomed me with open arms, asking about my family, my work, my dreams. She seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. Michael's father, Robert, was quieter but no less impressive. He'd built the insurance business from a small storefront into one of the most successful agencies in the region, and he had that old-school gentleman quality that made you feel respected and valued. He'd ask thoughtful questions about my job, remember details from previous conversations, and always made sure I felt included in family discussions. Michael's older sister Jennifer lived 2 hours away in Des Moines with her husband and twin daughters, but she came back for every major holiday and family gathering. She was successful in her own right, working as a marketing director for a large corporation, and she always made time to chat with me about work and life. The whole family seemed so functional, so different from the sometimes chaotic dynamics of my own large extended family. For the first couple of years, holidays at the Thompson house were genuinely wonderful. Patricia would assign everyone tasks for holiday meals, and we'd all work together in her spacious kitchen, laughing and telling stories while we cooked. I felt useful, included, part of something bigger than myself. Michael would wrap his arms around my waist while I stirred gravy. Patricia would ask for my opinion on seasoning, and Robert would make jokes that had us all giggling like teenagers. But somewhere around year 3 of our marriage, things began to shift in ways so subtle I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. It started with small comments that could be brushed off as helpful suggestions. Patricia would taste my contribution to dinner and say something like, "Oh, this is interesting. I usually add a bit more salt, but everyone has their own style." Or she'd rearrange the dishes I'd brought to better fit her table presentation, explaining that she had a system that worked best for serving. The seating arrangements began to change too, gradually and with perfectly reasonable explanations. First, I was moved away from Michael's side because Patricia needed to discuss some family business with him during dinner. Then I was seated with Jennifer's daughters because they just loved their Aunt Emma so much, and it would make them happy. Eventually, I found myself at what was essentially a children's table, making conversation with 2 8-year-olds while the adults discussed grown-up topics at the main table. My contributions to holiday meals slowly became expected rather than appreciated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What started as Emma, "Would you mind bringing your famous green bean casserole?" became Emma's handling the side dishes this year, without anyone actually asking if I wanted to handle the side dishes. The praise for my cooking began to get redirected too. Instead of, "Emma, this stuffing is incredible," it became, "Patricia, you've really outdone yourself this year." While Patricia would smile graciously and accept compliments for dishes she'd never touched. Michael seemed oblivious to these changes. Or maybe he just didn't want to see them. When I tried to bring up how uncomfortable I was becoming during family gatherings, he'd brush off my concerns with explanations that made me feel petty for even noticing. His mother was just particular about her hosting style. The seating arrangements were about practicality, not exclusion. I was being too sensitive, reading too much into innocent comments. Work became my refuge during this time. At Jefferson Elementary, I was still Emma Rodriguez, the administrator who could solve problems and make things happen. I threw myself into projects, stayed late to avoid going home to uncomfortable conversations about upcoming family gatherings, and found validation in the appreciation my colleagues showed for my efforts. But even there, I started to doubt myself, more second-guessing decisions I would have made confidently before, wondering if maybe I really was too sensitive, too demanding, too much. The breaking point came the summer before what would become our last Thompson family Thanksgiving. Patricia called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice warm and friendly, asking if I'd be willing to help coordinate the entire holiday meal. She was feeling overwhelmed, she said, and she trusted me to handle the details. She even asked for my stuffing recipe, claiming she wanted to learn my techniques because everyone always raves about it. I was honestly touched. After years of feeling like an outsider looking in, it seemed like Patricia was finally ready to welcome me as a true partner in family traditions. I spent weeks planning the menu, shopping for ingredients, preparing dishes that could be made ahead of time. I took 2 vacation days before Thanksgiving to ensure everything would be perfect, wanting to prove that I could handle the responsibility she'd given me. The night before Thanksgiving, I could barely sleep from excitement and nerves. This felt like my chance to finally earn my place in the Thompson family hierarchy, to show that I wasn't just Michael's wife, but a valuable member of the family in my own right. I got up at 5 a.m, loaded my car with casserole dishes and pie plates, and drove through the dark November morning feeling hopeful for the first time in months. Patricia greeted me at the door with a warm hug and immediate instructions. The kitchen was mine for the day, she said, since I was so much better at managing multiple dishes at once. She'd handle the hosting duties and make sure everyone was comfortable while I worked my magic in the kitchen. It sounded reasonable, even flattering, so I tied on my apron and got to work. For 8 straight hours, I prepared a feast that could have fed twice as many people as were coming. I brined and roasted a 20-pound turkey, made stuffing from scratch using bread I'd baked the day before, whipped real mashed potatoes, prepared 3 different vegetable sides, made gravy from turkey drippings, and put finishing touches on the 2 pies I'd baked earlier in the week. My feet ached, my back throbbed, and my hands were raw from washing dishes as I went, but I was proud of what I was creating. Meanwhile, the rest of the family relaxed in the living room, watching football, and catching up on family news. Occasionally, someone would drift into the kitchen to grab a drink or steal a taste of something, always complimenting my work and asking when dinner would be ready. Michael gave me a quick kiss and told me everything smelled amazing before returning to the game. Patricia would pop in periodically to check my progress and offer encouragement, always careful to stay out of my way since I clearly had everything under control. When it came time to serve dinner, I carved the turkey, arranged platters, filled serving bowls, and carried everything to the dining room where Patricia had set a beautiful table with her good china and crystal glasses. The family gathered around, exclaiming over how wonderful everything looked and smelled. Patricia beamed as she accepted their praise, graciously deflecting some of it with modest comments about how blessed she was to be able to provide such a feast for her family. Then came the moment that broke something inside me that I didn't even know was fragile. Patricia handed me a plate of food and gestured toward the kitchen where she'd set up a small folding table next to the breakfast nook. "I thought you might be more comfortable eating in there," she said with that same warm smile she'd worn all day. "It's quieter, and you've been working so hard. You deserve a peaceful meal." The dining room, she explained, was a bit crowded, with everyone there, and she thought I might appreciate some space to decompress after such a busy day. It was presented as a kindness, a consideration for my well-being. But as I walked back into that kitchen with my plate of food I'd spent all day preparing, I felt smaller than I'd ever felt in my entire life. I sat down at that wobbly folding table, listening to the sounds of my family enjoying the meal I'd created without me, and felt something crack inside my chest. This wasn't kindness. This wasn't consideration. This was exile disguised as courtesy, punishment masked as privilege. I was being sent to eat in the kitchen like hired help who should be grateful for the scraps. But the worst part wasn't my own humiliation. The worst part was seeing Lucas's face when he realized what was happening. My sweet, perceptive son kept turning around in his chair at the children's table to look at me through the doorway, his expression growing more confused and angry with each glance. He could see the injustice so clearly, could understand in his child's heart what I'd spent months trying to rationalize away. That's when Lucas stood up, his green eyes blazing with an indignation that made my heart swell and break at the same time. He didn't ask permission or wait for a pause in conversation. He simply cleared his throat and made his announcement with the kind of moral clarity that only children possess. "Before anyone says what they're grateful for," he said, his voice carrying clearly through both rooms, "I think everyone should know who actually cooked every single thing on this table." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the wall clock ticking in the kitchen and the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. The weight of that silence pressed down on all of us like a heavy blanket. I could see Patricia's face, changing from gracious hostess to something harder, more calculating. Michael's fork had stopped halfway to his mouth, and Jennifer was looking between her nephew and her mother with an expression I couldn't quite read. Robert cleared his throat, but no words came out. And Lucas, my brave little boy, stood there, with his chin raised and his hands clenched at his sides, waiting for someone to acknowledge what he'd said. I wanted to shrink into that folding chair, to disappear entirely, but I also felt a fierce pride in my son that threatened to overwhelm me. He had done what I couldn't do. He had spoken the truth that I'd been swallowing for months, the truth that was eating me alive from the inside out. In that moment, I saw myself through his eyes, and I didn't recognize the woman I'd become. When had I gotten so small? When had I started accepting crumbs and calling them a feast? Patricia was the first to recover her composure, smoothing her napkin across her lap with deliberate precision. "Lucas, honey," she said in that tone adults use when they're about to correct a child who's stepped out of line. "I think there might be some confusion here. Your mother helped, of course, but cooking a meal this size takes a team effort. Everyone contributed in their own way." But Lucas wasn't backing down. At 10 years old, he had more backbone than I'd shown in 3 years of marriage. "No, Grandma Patricia," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Mom got up at 5 this morning. She cooked the turkey and made the stuffing and the mashed potatoes and the green beans and the sweet potato casserole and both pies. She's been in the kitchen all day while everyone else watched TV. I helped her carry things from the car this morning, so I know she made everything at home too." The truth hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or wave away. Michael finally set down his fork and looked at me with an expression that might have been embarrassment or annoyance, I couldn't tell which. "Emma," he said quietly, "we should probably talk about this later." Later. Always later with Michael. Never now, never when it mattered, never when speaking up might actually change something. Later, when the moment had passed and the damage was done and everyone had agreed to pretend nothing had happened. I felt something shift inside me, a tectonic plate of resentment that had been building pressure for years. But this story didn't start with Lucas standing up in that dining room. It started much earlier, in small moments that seemed insignificant at the time but built into something that nearly destroyed who I was. To understand how we got to that Thanksgiving, I need to take you back to the beginning, to when I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world. When I first met Michael Thompson, I was working as a substitute teacher while finishing my education degree at the University of Northern Iowa. It was my senior year, and I was living in a tiny apartment near campus, surviving on ramen noodles and dreams of having my own classroom someday. I'd grown up in a family where education was everything, where my parents had sacrificed so much to make sure all 4 of their daughters could go to college and build better lives than they'd had. My parents, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, had immigrated from Mexico when I was 2 years old, carrying nothing but hope and an unshakable belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. My father worked construction during the day and cleaned office buildings at night, while my mother took care of other people's children so she could be home with her own. They spoke to us in Spanish at home, but insisted we master English at school, understanding that language would be our key to opportunities they'd never had. Growing up as the baby of the family meant I was simultaneously protected and pushed to excel. My 3 older sisters, Carmen, Sophia, and Isabel, had all followed the path my parents had laid out for them. Carmen became a nurse, Sophia a teacher, and Isabel an accountant. They were all successful, all married to good men, all living the American dream our parents had sacrificed everything to give us. But they'd also all stayed close to home, never venturing far from the tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone and family was everything. I loved my family deeply, but I'd always felt like I was meant for something different, something bigger. When I got the scholarship to uni, I was the first Rodriguez daughter to leave home for college, and the weight of everyone's expectations sat heavy on my shoulders. I was carrying not just my own dreams, but the dreams of parents who'd worked themselves to exhaustion to give me chances they'd never had. College was exciting and terrifying in equal measure. I was surrounded by students who'd grown up with privileges I'd never known, who talked casually about spring break trips to Cancun and summer internships their parents had arranged through family connections. I felt like an imposter half the time, like everyone could see that I didn't belong in their world of effortless confidence and inherited advantages. That's the mindset I was in when I met Michael at a campus coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday in October. I was hunched over my education textbooks, highlighting sections about classroom management and differentiated instruction, when someone slid into the seat across from me. I looked up to find a guy with kind green eyes and sandy brown hair, wearing a sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice warm with a slight Midwestern accent. "But I couldn't help noticing you've been studying for hours. You look like you could use a coffee refill, and I was wondering if you'd let me buy you one." It was such a simple gesture, but it caught me completely off guard. Most of the guys I'd met at college were either intimidated by my serious focus on academics or dismissive of it, assuming that a girl from my background couldn't possibly be as smart as they were. Michael was different. He seemed genuinely interested in what I was studying, asking thoughtful questions about my education classes and listening carefully to my answers. We talked for 2 hours that day, our conversation flowing as easily as if we'd known each other for years. He told me about growing up in Cedar Falls, about how his family had deep roots in the community, about his business classes and his plans to join his father's insurance agency after graduation. I told him about my family, about my dreams of becoming a teacher, about the pressure I felt to succeed not just for myself, but for everyone who'd believed in me. What struck me most about Michael was how he made me feel seen and valued for who I was, not where I came from. He didn't seem to care that my clothes were thrift store finds, or that I worked 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore to help pay for school. He was interested in my thoughts, my opinions, my dreams. For the first time since starting college, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Our relationship developed slowly, built on long conversations and shared study sessions and simple dates that fit my limited budget. Michael never made me feel bad about not being able to afford the expensive restaurants or entertainment that his other friends enjoyed. Instead, he seemed to prefer our quiet evenings talking over coffee or walking through the campus arboretum, learning about each other's hopes and fears. Meeting his family for the first time was intimidating in a way I'd never experienced before. The Thompson house was like something out of a magazine, a sprawling colonial with perfectly manicured landscaping and rooms full of antique furniture that had been passed down through generations. Everything spoke of stability, tradition, old money that had been carefully preserved and invested over decades. Patricia Thompson was exactly what I'd expected from Michael's descriptions, a woman who seemed to have stepped out of a Southern Living magazine. She was perfectly dressed, perfectly groomed, perfectly gracious as she welcomed me into her home. She asked about my studies, my family, my plans for the future, and she seemed genuinely interested in my answers. When I mentioned that my mother cleaned houses to help support our family, Patricia didn't flinch or change the subject. Instead, she talked about the dignity of hard work and how much she admired people who weren't afraid to do whatever it took to provide for their families. Robert Thompson was quieter, but no less welcoming. He had the kind of solid presence that made you feel safe and protected, like he was someone you could depend on in a crisis. He asked thoughtful questions about my education goals and shared stories about teachers who'd made a difference in his life. When I mentioned that I was hoping to work in Title I schools, serving students from low-income families, he nodded approvingly and said the world needed more teachers who understood what those children were going through. Jennifer was home from college that weekend, and she immediately took me under her wing like a big sister I'd never had. She was confident and accomplished, already talking about the internship she'd landed at a marketing firm in Chicago. But she never made me feel inferior or intimidated. Instead, she seemed excited to have another young woman in the family, someone she could share experiences with and offer advice to. That first dinner at the Thompson house felt like a glimpse into a life I'd never dared to imagine for myself. The conversation flowed easily around the table, touching on everything from politics to books to travel. Everyone seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, asking follow-up questions and building on my comments. Patricia served a meal that must have taken hours to prepare, but she made it look effortless, graciously accepting compliments, while deflecting attention to her guests. After dinner, we moved to the living room where Robert had built a fire in the stone fireplace. Patricia served coffee in delicate china cups, while Jennifer showed me photo albums full of family vacations and celebrations. Michael sat beside me on the antique sofa, his hand resting lightly on my knee, looking proud and happy to have me there. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself, something stable and enduring and beautiful. When Michael proposed 2 years later, it felt like the natural culmination of everything we'd built together. He'd been offered a position at his father's insurance agency, and I'd been hired as an administrative assistant at Jefferson Elementary, with the promise of moving into a teaching position once I completed my master's degree. We were both ready to start our adult lives, and we wanted to start them together. The wedding was everything I'd dreamed of and more. Patricia had insisted on handling most of the planning, claiming that she loved organizing events and wanted to give us the perfect day. She consulted with me on every detail, from the flowers to the menu to the music, making sure everything reflected both of our personalities and backgrounds. She even arranged for the ceremony to be bilingual, honoring my family's heritage in a way that brought tears to my mother's eyes. My parents were overwhelmed by the Thompson family's generosity and warmth. They'd been nervous about meeting Michael's family, worried that they wouldn't fit in or that their broken English would embarrass me. But Patricia and Robert went out of their way to make them feel welcome, praising my mother's cooking when she brought traditional Mexican dishes to the rehearsal dinner and asking my father about his work with genuine interest and respect. The early years of our marriage were exactly what I'd hoped they would be. Michael was a devoted husband who supported my career goals and encouraged me to pursue my master's degree. Patricia became the mother figure I'd always wanted, someone who offered advice and support without judgment. Robert treated me like the daughter he'd never had, and Jennifer became the sister I'd always wished for. We lived in a small house that Michael's parents had helped us buy, just a few blocks from the elementary school where I worked. It was our first real home together, and we threw ourselves into making it ours. We painted walls, planted gardens, hosted dinner parties for our friends, and talked about the children we wanted to have someday. Life felt full of possibility and promise. When Lucas was born 3 years into our marriage, I thought my happiness was complete. He was perfect in every way, with Michael's green eyes and my dark hair, and from the moment I held him, I knew that being his mother was the most important thing I would ever do. Michael was a wonderful father, patient and loving and completely devoted to our son. Patricia and Robert were doting grandparents who spoiled Lucas with attention and gifts, and Jennifer drove up from Des Moines every few weeks just to spend time with her nephew. I decided to take a leave of absence from teaching to focus on raising Lucas, and Michael supported the decision completely. We could afford for me to stay home, and both of us believed that having a parent at home during those crucial early years was important. I threw myself into motherhood with the same dedication I'd brought to everything else in my life, reading every book on child development I could find, and creating enriching experiences for Lucas every day. But somewhere in those early years of motherhood, I began to lose pieces of myself without even realizing it was happening. It started innocently enough, with small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time. Patricia would make suggestions about Lucas's schedule or his diet, and I'd defer to her experience as a mother. Michael would come home from work exhausted, and I'd handle the evening routine alone so he could relax. Family gatherings began to revolve more around what was convenient for everyone else, and I found myself adapting to fit whatever was needed. The changes were so gradual that I didn't notice them accumulating into something larger. I was still Emma, still the woman who dreamed of making a difference in children's lives, but I was also becoming someone smaller, someone who measured her worth by how well she accommodated everyone else's needs. And because I loved my family so much, because I wanted to belong so desperately, I convinced myself that this was what love looked like. When Lucas started kindergarten and I returned to work part-time, I felt like I was coming back to life. Being at Jefferson Elementary reminded me of who I was beyond being someone's wife and mother. I was good at my job, valued by my colleagues, making a real difference in children's lives. The principal, Mrs. Henderson, quickly recognized my organizational skills and leadership potential, offering me opportunities to take on additional responsibilities and grow professionally. But even as I was rediscovering my professional identity, the dynamics at home were shifting in ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Patricia's helpful suggestions became more frequent and more pointed. She'd comment on how I dressed. Lucas, implying that his clothes weren't quite right for family events. She'd mention that she'd noticed I looked tired and suggest that maybe I was taking on too much with work and motherhood. Michael began deferring to his mother's opinions more often, especially when it came to decisions about Lucas or our social calendar. When I'd express a different viewpoint, he'd remind me that Patricia had successfully raised 2 children and had more experience than I did. It was presented as practical advice, but it felt like my opinions were being systematically discounted and overruled. The holiday traditions that had once made me feel so included began to change as well. Patricia would assign tasks to everyone, but mine became increasingly focused on preparation and cleanup rather than the visible, praised aspects of hosting. I was the one who arrived early to help with setup and stayed late to help with dishes, while others got to enjoy the social aspects of the gatherings. When I tried to talk to Michael about how I was feeling, he'd reassure me that I was imagining problems where none existed. His family loved me, he'd say. They appreciated everything I did. I was being too sensitive, reading too much into innocent comments and normal family dynamics. And because I loved him and trusted him, I tried to believe that he was right. But Lucas saw what I was too afraid to acknowledge. Children have a clarity of vision that adults lose somewhere along the way, and my son could see that something was wrong with how I was being treated long before I was willing to admit it to myself. He'd ask me why I always had to work so hard, at family parties while everyone else got to have fun. He'd wonder why Grandma Patricia got credit for dishes that he'd watched me cook. He'd noticed that I seemed sad after spending time with his father's family, even though I always claimed I'd had a wonderful time. The breaking point was building for years before that Thanksgiving, accumulating in small moments of disrespect and dismissal that I'd learned to swallow and smile through. I'd become an expert at making excuses for other people's behavior, at finding reasonable explanations for treatment that deep down I knew was wrong. I'd convinced myself that keeping peace was more important than keeping my dignity, that being accommodating was the same as being loved. But Lucas hadn't learned to make those compromises yet. He still believed that right was right and wrong was wrong, that people should be treated fairly regardless of their position in the family hierarchy. And when he saw his mother being diminished and dismissed, when he watched me accept treatment that he instinctively knew was unjust, something inside him rebelled against the wrongness of it all. That's how we ended up in that dining room, with my 10-year-old son standing up to speak a truth that none of the adults had the courage to acknowledge. He didn't care about keeping peace or maintaining family harmony. He cared about his mother, being treated with the respect she deserved, and he was willing to risk everyone's displeasure to make sure that happened. The silence that followed his announcement stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could see the calculations happening behind Patricia's eyes, the careful consideration of how to handle this unexpected challenge to her authority. Michael looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, caught between his loyalty to his family and his son's undeniable truth. And I sat there in that kitchen, holding my breath and waiting to see what would happen next. That's when Patricia smiled, the same gracious smile she'd worn all day, and began to speak in that carefully modulated tone she used when she was about to rewrite reality to suit her purposes. "Oh, sweetheart," she said to Lucas, her voice dripping with condescension. "I think you might be confused about how cooking works. Yes, your mother helped in the kitchen today, and we're all very grateful for her assistance. But preparing a meal like this requires planning and coordination and years of experience. Everyone contributed in their own way." But Lucas wasn't buying it, and neither was I. Not anymore. The morning had started with such promise, such foolish hope that I almost laugh now thinking about how naive I was. Patricia's phone call 3 weeks earlier had caught me completely off guard. Not because she called, but because of the warmth in her voice, the genuine appreciation she seemed to express for everything I'd contributed to family gatherings over the years. She'd never acknowledged my efforts so directly before, and I clung to that recognition like a lifeline. "Emma, dear," she'd said, her voice carrying that musical quality it took on when she was being particularly charming. "I've been thinking about Thanksgiving, and I realize how much work I've been putting on your shoulders without really acknowledging it properly. This year, I'd love for you to take the lead on the cooking. You have such a gift for it, and honestly, I think it's time I stepped back and let the younger generation shine." The words had made my heart soar in a way that embarrassed me now. After years of feeling like an afterthought in the Thompson family hierarchy, here was Patricia finally recognizing my contributions, finally seeing me as capable of handling something as important as the family's Thanksgiving feast. I'd practically glowed with pride as she continued talking about how much she trusted my judgment, how she knew the meal would be perfect under my direction. "I've even been thinking about asking you for that stuffing recipe of yours," she continued, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Mine has been in the family for generations, but honestly, everyone always raves about yours. I think it might be time for this old dog to learn some new tricks." That conversation had replayed in my mind countless times over the following weeks as I planned and shopped and prepared. Patricia Thompson, the undisputed queen of Cedar Falls society entertaining, was asking me for my recipe. She was acknowledging that my cooking was not just adequate but superior to her own family traditions. It felt like the validation I'd been desperately seeking for years, proof that I'd finally earned my place in the family. I'd thrown myself into the preparation with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. I researched new techniques for achieving the perfect turkey skin, experimented with flavor combinations for my side dishes, and even drove to 3 different stores to find the exact type of cranberries I wanted for my homemade sauce. This was my chance to prove that I belonged, that I was worthy of the Thompson name, that I could contribute something meaningful to their family legacy. Michael had seemed pleased but distracted when I'd told him about his mother's request. "That's great, honey," he'd said, barely looking up from his laptop where he was reviewing insurance claims. "Mom's always been impressed with your cooking. This will be good for you." The casual way he'd dismissed what felt like a monumental shift in family dynamics should have been a warning sign, but I was too caught up in my excitement to pay attention to his lack of enthusiasm. Lucas had been the only one who seemed to understand how much this opportunity meant to me. He'd helped me make lists of ingredients, offered to assist with any tasks that were appropriate for a 10-year-old, and even practiced folding napkins the way I'd seen Patricia do for previous holidays. His excitement fed mine, and we'd spent several evenings planning the perfect meal together, discussing flavor profiles and presentation techniques as if we were preparing for a cooking competition. The night before Thanksgiving, I'd stayed up until almost midnight doing final preparations. I'd brined the turkey, made my cranberry sauce, prepared my pie crusts, and organized all my ingredients so that everything would go smoothly in the eye. Morning. I'd set my alarm for 5 a.m., wanting to give myself plenty of time to execute everything perfectly. This was my moment to shine, and I wasn't going to waste it. When I'd pulled into the Thompson driveway that morning, my car loaded with dishes and ingredients, I'd felt like I was arriving to claim my rightful place in the family. Patricia had greeted me at the door with that warm smile and an immediate hug, exclaiming over how early I was and how dedicated I was to making the day special. "The kitchen is all yours, dear," she'd said, gesturing toward the back of the house. "I'll stay out of your way and handle everything else." At first, it had felt wonderful to have complete control over the cooking process. Patricia's kitchen was a dream to work in, with professional-grade appliances and ample counter space for all my preparations. I'd felt like a chef in my own restaurant, orchestrating multiple dishes with the kind of precision and timing that comes from years of experience managing complex schedules. But as the hours passed and the rest of the family gathered in the living room, I'd begun to feel isolated rather than empowered. Every time I'd emerged from the kitchen to use the bathroom or grab something from my car, I'd found them all clustered together, laughing and talking and enjoying each other's company while I worked alone. When I'd tried to join conversations, they'd been polite but brief, clearly eager to return to their discussions without the interruption of someone who smelled like turkey grease and had flour under her fingernails. Jennifer had arrived with her twin daughters around noon, and the house had filled with the sounds of family reunion. I could hear them all catching up on news, sharing stories about work and school and life, creating new memories while I missed every moment of it. Occasionally, someone would drift into the kitchen to check on my progress or steal a taste of something, always complimenting my work, but never offering to help or suggesting that I take a break to join the family gathering. Michael had appeared in the kitchen around 2 o'clock, wrapping his arms around me from behind while I basted the turkey. "Everything smells incredible, Em," he'd murmured into my ear. "Mom's really impressed with how you've handled everything today. She keeps talking about what a treasure you are." Those words should have made me feel proud, but instead, they'd made me feel somehow diminished. A treasure to be appreciated. For my usefulness, my ability to provide service, but not necessarily to be included as an equal member of the family. I'd tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling, telling myself I was being too sensitive, that Michael was trying to be supportive. "Why don't you come sit with everyone for a while?" I'd suggested. "I could use a break, and I'd love to catch up with Jennifer." But Michael had already moved away, checking his phone for messages. "You've got this under control," he'd said, absently. "Besides, you know how Mom gets about timing for these big meals. Better to just let you work your magic." Work my magic. like I was some kind of kitchen wizard whose sole purpose was to create culinary perfection for everyone else's enjoyment. The phrase had stuck with me as I'd returned to my tasks, basting and stirring and checking temperatures while the sounds of family fellowship continued without me in the next room. By 4 o'clock, everything was ready. The turkey was golden and perfectly cooked. The side dishes were warm and beautifully presented, and I'd even managed to make a quick gravy from the pan drippings that was smooth and rich. I'd felt a surge of pride as I'd surveyed my work, knowing that I'd created something truly special for the people I loved. That's when Patricia had swept into the kitchen, taking charge of the final presentation with the kind of effortless authority she brought to everything she did. She'd rearranged some of my dishes to better fit her serving platters, adjusted the garnishes to match her aesthetic preferences, and added her own finishing touches to the table setting. It was done with such grace and apparent appreciation for my work that I'd felt churlish for minding the changes. "You've outdone yourself, Emma," she'd said as we'd carried the food to the dining room together. "This is going to be absolutely magnificent. Robert, come see what Emma has prepared for us." The family had gathered around the dining room table, exclaiming over the beautiful presentation and the incredible aromas filling the air. Patricia had stood at the head of the table, graciously accepting their praise and directing everyone to their seats with the kind of natural hostess instincts that had made her a legend in Cedar Falls social circles. That's when she'd handed me the plate and gestured toward the kitchen. "I thought you might be more comfortable eating in there, dear," she'd said, her voice full of what sounded like genuine concern for my well-being. "You've been working so hard all day and it's so much quieter in the kitchen. You'll be able to really enjoy your meal without all the chaos in here." The words had been delivered with such apparent kindness that I'd almost believed them myself. Almost convinced myself that being sent away from the family table with the meal I'd spent 14 hours preparing was somehow a gift, a considerate gesture designed for my comfort rather than my exclusion. But as I'd walked back into that kitchen and sat down at the folding table Patricia had set up next to the breakfast nook, the truth had hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't consideration. This was banishment. I was being removed from the family celebration like hired help who should be grateful for the scraps, like someone whose presence at the main table would somehow diminish the experience for the real family members. The meal I'd poured my heart into was being enjoyed without me. And worse, Patricia was accepting credit for my work with the same gracious smile she'd worn while sending me away. I'd sat there listening to the sounds of their enjoyment, hearing Patricia deflect compliments with false modesty while never once mentioning that I'd been the one to actually prepare everything they were praising. "Oh, you're too kind," I could hear her saying. "I just love being able to provide a beautiful meal for my family. It's such a blessing to be able to bring everyone together like this." My family. Her family. The distinction had never been clearer than in that moment, sitting alone in the kitchen while the people I'd thought were my family celebrated without me. I wasn't Michael's wife in that room. I was the woman who'd married into their family and needed to be reminded of her place in the hierarchy. I wasn't Lucas's mother deserving of respect and inclusion. I was the help who should be satisfied with whatever scraps of acknowledgement they chose to throw my way. That's when I'd looked up to see Lucas watching me through the doorway, his young face creased with confusion and growing anger. He'd been seated at what they called the children's table, even though at 10 years old he was perfectly capable of sitting with the adults and participating in grown-up conversation. But the Thompson family had their traditions, their ways of organizing gatherings that kept everyone in their proper place, and children belonged with children regardless of their maturity or capability. Lucas had always been perceptive beyond his years, picking up on social dynamics and emotional undercurrents that other children his age missed entirely. He could sense when adults were upset, even when they were trying to hide it, could detect dishonesty in situations where everyone else was pretending everything was fine. And right now, he could see through the polite fiction that his mother was in the kitchen by choice, that her exile from the family table was somehow for her own benefit. I'd watched his expression change as the reality of the situation sank in as he processed what he was seeing and understood the injustice of it. His green eyes had darkened with an indignation that would have been admirable in an adult and was absolutely remarkable in a child. He'd looked from me to the adults, at the main table, then back to me, and I could practically see him making the decision to act. The conversation in the dining room had been flowing along predictable lines, with everyone taking turns sharing what they were grateful for that year. Robert had talked about the success of his business and the blessing of having his family gathered together. Jennifer had expressed gratitude for her new promotion and for being able to raise her daughters in such a supportive extended family. Patricia had spoken eloquently about the joy of providing a beautiful home where everyone could come together to create lasting memories. When it was Michael's turn, he'd talked about how grateful he was for his family's health and happiness, for the stability of his career, and for being able to carry on the Thompson family traditions that meant so much to all of them. He'd mentioned being thankful for his wonderful wife who worked so hard to take care of everyone, but it was said almost as an afterthought, a perfunctory acknowledgement that felt more obligatory than heartfelt. The twins had shared their gratitude for their toys and their friends and their upcoming Christmas presents, their childish responses drawing indulgent laughter from the adults. And then it was Lucas's turn, and I could see him straightening in his chair, preparing to speak with the kind of deliberate intention that meant he'd been thinking carefully about what he wanted to say. "I'm grateful for my mom," he'd started, his voice clear and steady. "She works really hard to take care of me and Dad, and she's always there when I need her. She helps me with my homework and takes me to soccer practice and makes sure I have everything I need for school." The adults had nodded approvingly, probably expecting him to continue with more typical childhood gratitudes. But Lucas wasn't finished, and his next words had carried a weight that made everyone pay closer attention. "I'm also grateful that my mom is so good at cooking," he'd continued, his voice growing stronger. "She got up really early this morning to make sure everything would be perfect for today. She spent all day in the kitchen making the turkey and the stuffing and all the other food, and she did it because she loves our family and wants everyone to be happy." I could hear the shift in the room's energy, even from my position in the kitchen, could sense that Lucas was building towards something that was making the adults uncomfortable. Patricia's voice had carried a note of warning when she'd responded. "That's very sweet, Lucas. We're all grateful for your mother's help today. Help, not work, not skill, not the complete responsibility for creating their entire feast. Help, as if I'd been a minor contributor to someone else's effort." The word had hit me like a slap, crystallizing everything that was wrong with my position in this family. Everything I'd been trying to ignore and rationalize and accept as normal. But Lucas hadn't been willing to let that characterization stand. He'd pushed back with the kind of moral clarity that only children possess, the refusal to accept adult euphemisms and polite fictions when the truth was so obviously different. And that's when he'd stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and delivered the words that would change everything. "Before anyone says what they're grateful for," he'd announced, his voice carrying clearly through both rooms, "I think everyone should know who actually cooked every single thing on this table." The silence that had followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat and the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Every conversation had stopped mid-sentence. Every fork had paused halfway to its destination. Every eye had turned toward my 10-year-old son who had just shattered the comfortable fiction that had been sustaining this family gathering. Patricia had been the first to recover, her voice taking on that carefully controlled tone she used when she was managing a social situation that threatened to spiral out of control. "Lucas, sweetheart," she'd said, "I think there might be some confusion here. Cooking a meal this size is always a team effort. Everyone contributes in their own special way." But Lucas hadn't backed down, hadn't allowed himself to be dismissed or redirected by adult authority. "No, Grandma Patricia," he'd said, his voice steady and unwavering. "Mom did everything. She cooked the turkey and made the stuffing and the Mashed potatoes and the green beans and the sweet potato casserole and both pies. She's been working in the kitchen all day while everyone else was watching TV and talking. I know because I helped her carry all the food in from the car this morning. The truth had hung in the air like an accusation, impossible to deny or deflect. Every adult in that room knew that Lucas was absolutely right, that my contributions hadn't been help or assistance but the complete creation of their entire celebration. They'd all seen me working alone in the kitchen while they'd relaxed and socialized, had all accepted the fruits of my labor while giving credit to someone else. Michael had finally found his voice, but instead of supporting his son's truth-telling or acknowledging my work, he'd tried to shut down the conversation entirely. "Lucas, that's enough," he'd said, his voice tight with embarrassment. "We can talk about this later. Right now, we need to focus on enjoying our meal together." Later. Always later with Michael. Never now when it might actually matter. Never. In the moment when speaking up could make a difference, when acknowledgement could restore dignity, when truth could triumph over comfortable lies. Always later, when the damage was done and everyone had agreed to pretend nothing had happened. But I was tired of later. Tired of waiting for some day when things would be different, when I'd finally be treated with the respect I deserved, when my contributions would be acknowledged and valued. Sitting there in that kitchen, listening to my husband prioritize his family's comfort over his wife's dignity, something inside me finally broke free from the chains of politeness and accommodation I'd been wearing for years. I stood up from that folding table, my legs unsteady from hours of standing and cooking, and walked toward the dining room where my family was waiting. Not Michael's family, not the Thompson clan with their traditions and hierarchies and careful social management. My family, which consisted of exactly one person who had shown the courage to speak up for what was right. Lucas looked at me as I appeared in the doorway, his green eyes bright with unshed tears and stubborn determination. He'd taken a stand, for his mother when no one else would, had risked the displeasure of every adult in the room to defend my dignity and acknowledge my worth. My 10-year-old son had shown more backbone and moral courage than his father, more integrity than his grandparents, more basic human decency than any of the adults who were supposed to be the mature ones in this situation. "Lucas is absolutely right," I said, my voice surprisingly steady given how my hands were shaking. I did cook every single dish on this table, every turkey slice, every spoonful of stuffing, every bite of mashed potatoes came from my hands and my effort and my time. I spent 14 hours creating this feast, and I did it out of love for this family, hoping that maybe this year would be different, that maybe I'd finally be treated like I belonged here. The words came pouring out of me like water through a broken dam, years of suppressed frustration and swallowed pride finally finding their voice. I looked around the table at these people I'd been trying so hard to please, these family members whose approval I'd been desperately seeking, and I saw them clearly for perhaps the first time. Patricia's face had gone pale, except for 2 spots of color high on her cheeks, her carefully composed expression cracking to reveal something harder and less pleasant underneath. Robert was staring at his plate, refusing to meet my eyes, his discomfort with confrontation evident in every line of his body. Jennifer looked like she wanted to disappear entirely, caught between loyalty to her mother and the obvious truth of what I was saying. And Michael, my husband, the man who had promised to love and honor me, was looking at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into his family's private gathering and started making unreasonable demands. Not like his wife who deserved his support, not like the mother of his child who had just been publicly humiliated, but like an embarrassing problem that needed to be managed and contained. That look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know about where I really stood in this family, about what my marriage had become, about the future I could expect if I continued to accept this treatment. And for the first time in years, I felt something stronger than my need to keep the peace, stronger than my desire to be accepted, stronger than my fear of rocking the boat. I felt angry, and that anger was about to change everything. The anger that had been building inside me for years finally found its voice, and I discovered that once you start speaking truth, it becomes impossible to stop. The words kept coming, each one feeling like a weight being lifted from my chest, each sentence undoing years of careful silence and swallowed pride. I arrived here at 6 this morning, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I brought everything, from my own kitchen because I wanted this day to be perfect. I spent my own money on groceries, used my own recipes, invested my own time and energy into creating something beautiful for this family. And in return, I was treated like hired help and sent to eat alone in the kitchen while everyone else enjoyed the fruits of my labor. Patricia's carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack around the edges. The gracious hostess mask was slipping, revealing something sharper and less pleasant underneath. "Emma, dear," she said, her voice carrying a warning note. "I think you're overreacting to what was meant as a kindness. The kitchen is quieter, more peaceful. I thought you might appreciate some space to decompress after working so hard." But I wasn't buying the polite fiction anymore, wasn't willing to accept the reframing of my humiliation as consideration for my well-being. If you wanted me to have a peaceful meal, you could have offered to help with the cooking. You could have suggested we work together, or that someone else handle some of the dishes. Instead, you watched me work alone for 8 hours and then excluded me from the celebration I created. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier with the weight of acknowledgement. No one could pretend anymore that this was about misunderstanding or oversensitivity. The truth was out there now, stark and undeniable, and everyone in that room had to decide how they were going to respond to it. Robert cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Emma," he said, his voice carefully measured, "I think perhaps we should all take a step back here. Family gatherings can be stressful, and sometimes emotions run high. Maybe we can discuss this more calmly after everyone has had a chance to—" "No," I interrupted, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "We're not going to table this discussion for later. We're not going to pretend this didn't happen and go back to the way things were. Lucas had the courage to speak up for what was right, and he deserves to see that truth matters, that standing up for people you love isn't something to be ashamed of or apologize for." I looked at my son, still standing beside his chair with his chin raised defiantly, and felt a surge of pride so intense it almost brought tears to my eyes. This brave, principled child had shown more integrity in 5 minutes than the adults in his life had demonstrated in years. He deserved to see that his mother could be equally brave, equally unwilling to accept injustice, equally committed to doing what was right even when it was difficult. "Lucas is 10 years old," I continued, "and he could see what was wrong with this situation when all of you adults chose to ignore it. He watched his mother be treated with disrespect and decided that wasn't acceptable. He spoke up because he loves me, and because he has a sense of fairness that apparently gets beaten out of people as they get older and more concerned with keeping the peace." Michael finally found his voice, but his words were not what I'd hoped to hear. "Emma, please," he said, his tone pleading but also embarrassed. "You're making this into something it doesn't need to be. Can't we just enjoy the meal and deal with this privately later?" There it was again. Later. The magical time when difficult conversations could be had without witnesses, when my legitimate grievances could be dismissed as emotional overreaction, when the status quo could be restored with minimal disruption to everyone else's comfort. But I was done with later, done with private conversations that led nowhere, done with protecting other people's feelings at the expense of my own dignity. "No, Michael," I said, and I watched his eyes widen at the flat refusal. "We're not going to deal with this later. We're going to deal with it now, in front of the same people who witnessed my humiliation. Lucas deserves to see that his mother won't be dismissed or silenced. That speaking truth is worth the discomfort it causes." I turned to face Patricia directly, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that surprised us both. You asked me to take charge of this meal, Patricia. You told me you trusted my judgment and appreciated my skills. You asked for my recipes and made me believe that I was finally being recognized for my contributions. But that was all manipulation, wasn't it? You wanted the work done without having to do it yourself, and you wanted to maintain control over how the credit was distributed. Patricia's mask slipped completely then, her gracious hostess persona disappearing to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "How dare you?" she said, her voice sharp with indignation. "How dare you stand in my home and accuse me of manipulation? I have welcomed you into this family, treated you with nothing but kindness, and this is how you repay that generosity?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized that this was the moment of truth. This was where I could either back down, apologize, return to my place in the family hierarchy, or stand firm and accept the consequences of refusing to be diminished any longer. "Your kindness," I repeated, letting the irony color my voice. "Is that what you call it when you take credit for someone else's work? Is that what you call it when you exclude someone from the celebration they created? Is that what you call it when you treat your son's wife like hired help, who should be grateful for whatever scraps of acknowledgement you choose to throw her way?" The room erupted then, years of careful politeness and suppressed tensions finally breaking through. "The surface." Jennifer spoke up for the first time, her voice defensive and sharp. "You are being completely unreasonable, Emma. Mom has always been kind to you, always included you in everything. You're twisting normal family dynamics into some kind of persecution narrative." But Lucas, my brave boy, wasn't going to let that stand. "That's not true, Aunt Jennifer," he said, his young voice cutting through the adult protests. "Mom never gets to sit with the family at dinner. She always has to work in the kitchen while everyone else talks and laughs. And Grandma Patricia always gets thanked for the food Mom makes. I've been watching, and it's not fair." Out of the mouths of babes, my 10-year-old son had just articulated the pattern of behavior that the adults in the room had been pretending didn't exist. His simple, honest observation carried more weight than all the adult rationalizations and justifications because it came from someone who had no agenda other than fairness and love for his mother. Robert tried to regain control of the situation, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in business meetings. "I think we all need to calm down and remember that we're family here. Family means accepting each other's differences and working through disagreements with respect and understanding." "Family," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Is that what this is? Because from where I'm standing, family means supporting each other, recognizing each other's contributions, and treating each other with basic dignity. What I've been experiencing isn't family. It's a hierarchy where I'm expected to serve and be grateful for the privilege." Michael stood up then, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made everyone flinch. "That's enough, Emma," he said, his voice carrying a note of authority that I'd never heard directed at me before. "You're embarrassing yourself and disrespecting my family. I think you need to apologize and we can move on from this." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed so clearly where Michael's loyalties lay. Not with his wife, who had been humiliated and marginalized, not with his son, who had shown remarkable courage in speaking up for what was right, but with his family of origin and their comfort and reputation. He was asking me to apologize for refusing to accept mistreatment, to back down from defending my own dignity, to return to my place in the family structure that had been slowly crushing my spirit for years. "No," I said, the word coming out, stronger and clearer than I'd expected. "I will not apologize for speaking the truth. I will not apologize for expecting to be treated with respect in my own family. And I will not apologize for teaching my son that standing up for what's right is more important than keeping people comfortable." The silence that followed was different from all the others, charged with the recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the room. Everyone understood that we'd crossed a line, that the careful balance of power and deference that had governed our family relationships had been irreparably altered. Patricia stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she spoke, her voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. "I think it's time for you to leave, Emma. This is my home, and I will not tolerate this kind of disrespect from anyone, family or otherwise." The words should have hurt, should have made me feel rejected and cast out, but instead they felt like liberation. The pretense was over, the polite fiction had been abandoned, and everyone's true feelings were finally out in the open. I was being asked to leave not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I'd refused to pretend that being treated poorly was somehow acceptable. "You're absolutely right, Patricia," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional upheaval I was feeling. "This is your home and you have every right to ask me to leave. But I want to be clear about why I'm being asked to go. It's not because I was disrespectful, it's because I refused to accept disrespect. It's not because I was ungrateful, it's because I expected my contributions to be acknowledged. It's not because I was causing problems, it's because I refused to pretend that there weren't problems." I turned to Michael, who was standing frozen beside his chair, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. "Michael, you have a choice to make here. You can come with your wife and son, or you can stay with your family of origin. But I'm not going to continue participating in a dynamic that teaches Lucas that it's acceptable to treat people this way." The moment stretched between us, heavy with the weight of our entire marriage, our shared history, our dreams for the future. I could see him calculating, weighing his options, trying to find a way to maintain his position in both families without having to choose sides. But some choices can't be avoided, and this was one of them. "Emma, please," he said, his voice pleading. "You're making this into something it doesn't have to be. Can't we just—" "No," I interrupted. "We can't just anything. This is exactly what it has to be. This is the moment where you decide whether you're going to stand with your wife and son or with the people who think it's acceptable to treat us this way." I walked over to Lucas, who was still standing beside his chair, his young face pale but determined. "Come on, sweetheart," I said, holding out my hand. "We're going to go home now." He took my hand without hesitation, his small fingers intertwining, with mine in a gesture of solidarity that made my heart swell with pride and love. Whatever else happened, whatever consequences we faced, I knew that my son and I were on the same side, united in our commitment to treating people with dignity and respect. "Where are we going to go?" Lucas asked as we walked toward the front door, his voice small but trusting. "Home," I said simply. "We're going home." Behind us, I could hear the family erupting in conversation, their voices overlapping as they processed what had just happened. I didn't turn around to see Michael's face, didn't wait to hear whether he would follow us or stay with his parents. The choice was his to make, and I was done trying to influence it. The drive home was quiet, Lucas sitting in the passenger seat, with his seatbelt pulled tight across his chest, staring out the window at the familiar streets of our neighborhood. We drove past houses where other families were gathering for their own Thanksgiving celebrations, and I wondered how many of them were dealing with their own versions of the drama we'd just left behind. "Mom," Lucas said as we pulled into our driveway, "are you and Dad going to get divorced?" The question hung in the air between us, stark and honest in the way that only children can be. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, considering how to answer. I could lie, could offer false reassurances about how everything would work out fine, could protect him from the reality of what our family was facing. But Lucas had just shown remarkable courage in speaking truth to power, and he deserved honesty from me in return. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said finally. "That's going to depend on whether your father decides that treating us with respect is more important than keeping his parents happy. But whatever happens, you and I are going to be okay. We're going to take care of each other, and we're going to build a life where people treat each other with kindness and respect." Lucas nodded. his young face serious with understanding. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said. "You were really brave back there." The words brought tears to my eyes, partly from pride and partly from the bittersweetness of receiving validation from my 10-year-old son when I couldn't get it from my husband. "I'm proud of you too, Lucas. You stood up for what was right, even when it was scary. That takes real courage." We sat in the car for a few more minutes, processing the events of the day and preparing ourselves for whatever came next. The house felt different when we walked in, charged with the possibility of change and the uncertainty of the future. But it also felt like ours in a way it hadn't before, like a place where we could be ourselves without having to constantly accommodate other people's expectations and demands. Michael came home 3 hours later, his face haggard with stress and conflict. He found us in the living room, Lucas doing homework at the coffee table while I graded papers from my students. The scene was domestic and peaceful, a sharp contrast to the drama we'd left behind at his parents' house. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Yes, we do," I agreed, setting aside my papers. "But first, I want you to know that I'm not sorry for what happened today. I'm not sorry for standing up for myself, and I'm not sorry for teaching Lucas that his mother deserves to be treated with respect." Michael sat down heavily in his armchair, rubbing his hands over his face. "My parents are furious," he said. "They're talking about not speaking to us anymore, about cutting us out of family events." "And how do you feel about that?" I asked, genuinely curious about his response. "I feel like my family is falling apart," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I feel like I'm being forced to choose between the people I love most in the world." "You are being forced to choose," I said gently. "But not by me. The choice is between enabling people who treat your wife and son poorly, or standing up for what's right. I can't make that decision for you, Michael. But I can tell you that Lucas and I won't continue to participate in family dynamics that diminish our worth and dignity." The conversation that followed was long and difficult, full of tears and accusations and moments of genuine connection. Michael was angry at me for ruining the family gathering, but he was also forced to acknowledge that Lucas and I had been treated unfairly. He was hurt by his parents' reaction, but he was also beginning to see their behavior through our eyes. It took several more conversations over the following weeks before Michael was able to fully understand what had happened and why it mattered. His parents, meanwhile, maintained their position that I had been disrespectful and ungrateful, that I had turned a minor misunderstanding into a major family crisis. They expected an apology from me, a return to the previous dynamic, and a promise that such scenes would never happen again. The apology never came, because I had nothing to apologize for. Instead, Michael and I worked together to establish new boundaries with his family, new expectations for how we would be treated and what we would accept. Some of those boundaries were respected, others were not, and gradually we found ourselves spending less time with the Thompson family and more time building our own traditions. That was 3 years ago. Today, Lucas is 13, a confident teenager who has learned that standing up for what's right is worth the discomfort it sometimes causes. He still remembers that Thanksgiving as the day his mother found her voice, and he's proud of the role he played in helping that happen. Michael eventually came to understand that supporting his wife and son wasn't a betrayal of his parents, but a fulfillment of his responsibilities as a husband and father. We still have dinner with his parents occasionally, but the dynamic has changed permanently. I'm no longer the accommodating daughter-in-law who accepts whatever treatment is offered. I'm a woman who knows her worth and expects to be treated accordingly. Sometimes that makes family gatherings tense, but it also makes them honest in a way they never were before. Patricia and I will never have the relationship I once hoped for, and I've made peace with that. Some people are simply not capable of treating others as equals, and no amount of accommodation or service will change that fundamental character flaw. What I've learned is that you can't make people respect you, but you can refuse to accept disrespect. Lucas learned something important that day too. He learned that sometimes the right thing to do is the difficult thing, that standing up for people you love is worth the consequences, and that truth has power even when it's spoken by the smallest voice in the room. He learned that his mother was stronger than she looked, braver than she knew, and worthy of respect even when others couldn't see it. The holidays are different now. Sometimes we spend them with Michael's family, sometimes with mine, and sometimes we create our own celebrations with friends who treat us with the respect and inclusion we deserve. Lucas helps with the cooking, not because he has to, but because he wants to. He sets the table with care, knowing that everyone who contributes to the meal will have a place at it. He's learned that family isn't just about blood relations, but about how people treat each other, about whether they lift each other up or tear each other down. I think about that Thanksgiving often, about the moment when everything changed, about the choice between dignity and accommodation that we all face at various points in our lives. I think about how easy it would have been to swallow my pride one more time, to accept the kitchen table and the scraps of acknowledgement, to teach my son that keeping peace was more important than demanding respect. But I'm grateful that Lucas spoke up first, that his young voice cut through years of accumulated silence and pretense. I'm grateful that he showed me what courage looked like, that he reminded me that some things are worth fighting for even when the fight is difficult and the outcome uncertain. The truth is that standing up for yourself is never easy, especially when you're dealing with people you love, people whose approval you've spent years trying to earn. But what I learned that day is that approval earned through diminishing yourself isn't worth having. That love that requires you to accept mistreatment isn't really love at all. I learned that children are watching everything we do, learning from our examples what relationships should look like, what treatment is acceptable, what their own worth should be. Lucas was watching when I accepted being sent to the kitchen, and he was watching when I finally found the courage to speak up. The lesson he took from that day wasn't about family conflict or holiday drama. It was about standing up for what's right, about refusing to accept injustice, about the power of truth even when it's uncomfortable. Today, when I cook holiday meals, I do it because I want to, not because it's expected of me. I cook with family members who help and contribute, who share the work and the credit, who make sure everyone has a place at the table they helped create. I cook for people who appreciate not just the food, but the effort behind it, who see the love and care that goes into each dish, who understand that sharing a meal is about more than just eating together. And when Lucas brings friends home for dinner, I watch him make sure everyone feels included, everyone feels welcome, everyone gets a seat at the table. I watch him stand up for classmates who are being treated unfairly, speak up when he sees injustice, refuse to participate in dynamics that diminish others. I know that the lessons he learned that Thanksgiving have shaped who he's becoming, and I'm proud of the young man he's growing into. The story of that Thanksgiving isn't really about family conflict or holiday drama. It's about the moment when silence becomes unbearable, when accommodation becomes self-destruction, when the cost of keeping peace becomes higher than the cost of speaking truth. It's about the courage it takes to stand up for yourself and the people you love, even when doing so means risking the very relationships you're trying to protect. Most of all, it's about the power of a child's voice, the clarity of a young person's moral vision, the way children can see through adult pretenses and call us back to what really matters. Lucas didn't speak up that day because he understood complex family dynamics or social hierarchies. He spoke up because he saw his mother being treated unfairly, and he couldn't accept that injustice even when every adult in the room was willing to pretend it wasn't happening. That's the voice we all need to listen to, the voice that says this isn't right, this isn't fair, this isn't how people should treat each other. It's the voice that refuses to accept explanations and excuses for behavior that diminishes human dignity. It's the voice that insists on truth even when truth is uncomfortable, that demands justice even when justice is inconvenient. Sometimes that voice comes from a 10-year-old boy standing up at the Thanksgiving table, refusing to let his mother be invisible any longer. Sometimes it comes from within ourselves, when we finally find the courage to say no more, to demand better, to stand up for our own worth and dignity. Either way, it's a voice worth listening to, worth following, worth celebrating, because in the end, that's the voice that changes everything. The weeks that followed that Thanksgiving were some of the most challenging and transformative of my life. The immediate aftermath felt like living in the eye of a hurricane, with phone calls and messages swirling around us as the extended family tried to process what had happened and decide where their loyalties lay. Some supported Patricia's version of events, claiming I had been dramatic and ungrateful. Others, particularly the younger generation, quietly reached out to express their understanding and support for my position. Michael's sister Jennifer called me 2 days after Thanksgiving, her voice hesitant and careful. "Emma," she said, "I've been thinking about what happened, and I owe you an apology. I was so focused on protecting Mom's feelings that I didn't really consider how you must have been feeling all these years. Looking back, I can see patterns that I should have noticed before." Her call was unexpected and deeply meaningful. Jennifer went on to explain that after we'd left, she'd started thinking about other family gatherings, other times when I'd been relegated to kitchen duty while everyone else socialized. She remembered holidays where my contributions had been minimized or attributed to others, instances where my opinions had been dismissed or my presence had been treated as optional rather than essential. "I realize now that we created a system where you were expected to serve without being truly included," she said. "That wasn't fair, and I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I was so used to how things were that I didn't question whether they were right." Jennifer's apology meant more to me than she probably realized. It validated my experience in a way that helped counteract the gaslighting I'd been experiencing from other family members who insisted I was overreacting or misinterpreting innocent situations. Having someone else acknowledge the patterns I'd been seeing helped me trust my own perceptions and feel confident in the stand I'd taken. But not everyone was as reflective or understanding. Patricia's older sister Margaret called to lecture me about family loyalty and the importance of respecting one's elders. "Patricia has been nothing but kind to you over the years," she insisted. "She opened her home to you, included you in family traditions, treated you like one of her own daughters. For you to turn around and attack her like that, in front of everyone, was cruel and unnecessary." These conversations were exhausting and often demoralizing. I found myself repeatedly having to defend not just my actions, but my right to be treated with basic respect. Some family members seemed genuinely unable to understand why being asked to eat in the kitchen was problematic, why taking credit for someone else's work was hurtful, why years of subtle marginalization might eventually reach a breaking point. Lucas, meanwhile, was processing the situation in his own way. He'd been quiet and thoughtful since that day, clearly understanding that something significant had happened but not entirely grasping all the implications. One evening about a week after Thanksgiving, as we were doing dishes together, he looked up at me with those serious green eyes and asked a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Mom, did I do something wrong when I told everyone you cooked the food?" The question broke my heart because it revealed that despite his brave stand, he was now second-guessing himself, wondering if he'd caused problems rather than addressed them. I dried my hands and knelt down to his level, taking his hands in mine. "Lucas," I said, looking directly into his eyes, "what you did that day was one of the bravest and most important things I've ever seen anyone do. You saw something unfair happening, and you spoke up about it even though you knew it might make people uncomfortable. That's exactly what a person with integrity does." He nodded slowly, but I could see he was still troubled. "But everyone got mad," he said. "Dad looked upset, and Grandma Patricia didn't want us to come back. Sometimes," I explained, "when you tell the truth about something that's been wrong for a long time, people get upset because they don't want to face that wrongness. That doesn't mean you shouldn't tell the truth. I wouldn't expect anything else." But when we arrived that Thanksgiving, it was clear that some old patterns were attempting to reassert themselves. Patricia had prepared most of the meal herself, relegating my contribution to a single side dish, and had arranged the seating so that I was placed at the far end of the table, away from the main conversations. This time, however, the response was swift and united. Michael immediately suggested rearranging the seating to better accommodate conversation, while Lucas cheerfully moved his chair to sit next to mine, ensuring I wasn't isolated. When Patricia began accepting compliments for dishes I recognized as my own recipes from previous years, Michael smoothly redirected the praise appropriately. The evening wasn't perfect, but it was manageable because we'd established clear boundaries and were prepared to maintain them. More importantly, Lucas saw his parents working together to ensure fair treatment for everyone, modeling the kind of partnership and mutual respect that healthy relationships require. As months passed, some family relationships began to heal, while others remained distant. Jennifer and I developed a closer friendship, bonded by honest conversations about family dynamics and our shared commitment to raising children who value fairness and respect. Her daughters, Lucas's cousins, began to spend more time with us, and I enjoyed watching Lucas take on a protective older cousin role, always making sure everyone felt included in games and activities. Robert, Michael's father, made subtle but meaningful gestures toward reconciliation. He began asking me direct questions about my work and interests, remembering details from previous conversations, and making sure I felt included in family discussions. He never explicitly apologized for past behavior, but his actions demonstrated a recognition that changes were needed. Patricia remained the most resistant to change, still occasionally making comments that suggested she viewed the situation as my overreaction rather than a legitimate grievance. But even she seemed to understand that the old dynamics were no longer acceptable, and she made efforts to include me more meaningfully in family activities. The most profound change was in my own sense of self-worth and confidence. Having stood up for myself in such a public and definitive way had awakened something in me that had been dormant for years. I began speaking up more confidently at work, advocating for policies and programs I believed in, rather than deferring to others' opinions. I joined the school's leadership committee and eventually became its chair, using my organizational skills and educational background to make meaningful improvements in our students' experiences. Lucas continued to thrive, developing into a teenager, with strong moral convictions and the courage to act on them. He became involved in peer mediation at school, helping other students resolve conflicts fairly and respectfully. His teachers frequently commented on his leadership abilities and his willingness to stand up for classmates who were being treated unfairly. "I learned from watching you, Mom," he told me one day when I asked him about his involvement in various social justice activities at school. "You showed me that sometimes you have to speak up even when it's scary, even when people don't want to hear what you're saying. You taught me that keeping quiet about unfairness makes you part of the problem." Those words were perhaps the greatest validation I could have received for the difficult stand I'd taken that Thanksgiving day. My son had learned the lessons I'd hoped to teach him, not through lectures or punishments, but through witnessing his mother refuse to accept less than she deserved. The ripple effects of that one day continued to spread through our lives in ways I hadn't anticipated. Other women in our community began reaching out to me, sharing their own stories of family dynamics that made them feel diminished or undervalued. Some were dealing with in-laws who marginalized them, others with spouses who failed to support them in conflicts, still others with extended family members who took their contributions for granted. These conversations reminded me that my experience wasn't unique, that countless women struggle with the balance between maintaining relationships and maintaining self-respect. Many had been told, as I had been, that they were being too sensitive, too demanding, too difficult when they asked for basic respect and recognition. I began to understand that my story wasn't just about one family's dysfunction, but about broader patterns of how women's contributions are often minimized, how their voices are dismissed, how their comfort is sacrificed for others' convenience. The courage Lucas had shown in speaking up for his mother represented something larger: the importance of calling out injustice wherever we see it, regardless of how uncomfortable that calling out might make others. Years have passed since that transformative Thanksgiving, and our family has found a new equilibrium that works for everyone involved. Lucas is now in college, studying social work with a focus on family systems and conflict resolution. He credits that early experience with shaping his career goals and his understanding of how family dynamics can either support or undermine individual dignity. Michael and I have a stronger marriage than we ever had before, built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to honest communication. He learned that supporting his wife didn't mean betraying his parents, but rather living up to his responsibilities as a husband and father. I learned that demanding respect wasn't selfish or unreasonable, but necessary for maintaining my own mental health and modeling healthy relationships for my son. Our relationship with Michael's parents has stabilized into something cordial, but boundaried. We attend family functions when appropriate, but with clear expectations about how everyone will be treated. Patricia and I will never have the close relationship I once hoped for, but we've found a way to coexist respectfully, and that's enough. The most important outcome of that difficult day was the lesson it taught all of us about the power of speaking truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. Lucas learned that his voice mattered, that standing up for people he loved was worth the risk of disappointing others. Michael learned that neutrality in the face of injustice is actually a form of complicity. I learned that I was stronger and braver than I'd given myself credit for, that my worth wasn't dependent on other people's approval or recognition. Looking back, I'm grateful for every difficult moment of that experience because it forced us all to grow, to examine our values, and to become better versions of ourselves. The woman who sat silent at that folding table in the kitchen was someone I barely recognize now. Someone who had forgotten her own worth, who had confused accommodation with love, who had taught her son that keeping peace was more important than demanding justice. The woman I am today knows that respect isn't something you earn through service or silence, but something you claim through courage and maintain through boundaries. I know that family love should lift you up, not tear you down, should celebrate your contributions rather than minimize them, should include you rather than exile you to the margins. Most importantly, I know that children are always watching, always learning from our examples about what relationships should look like, what treatment is acceptable, what their own worth should be. The greatest gift I gave Lucas that day wasn't the courage to speak up for me. It was the model of a mother who finally found the courage to speak up for herself. That Thanksgiving changed everything for our family, not because it destroyed our relationships, but because it forced us to build better ones. It taught us that sometimes love requires difficult conversations, that sometimes respect demands uncomfortable confrontations, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept unloving treatment. The table I sit at now, whether it's in my own home or someone else's, is one where my voice is heard, my contributions are acknowledged, and my presence is valued. It's a table where my son has learned that everyone deserves respect, that fairness matters more than convenience, that truth is more important than comfort. And that's a lesson worth any amount of temporary discomfort, any family tension, any difficult conversation. Because in the end, what we teach our children about their worth, about their right to be treated with dignity, about their responsibility to speak up for themselves and others, those lessons will shape not just their families, but their entire lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. It means the truth was needed even more than you realized. We talked for a long time that night about courage, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult, about the difference between causing problems and exposing problems that already existed. I wanted him to understand that his actions had been heroic, not destructive, that he'd helped his mother find her own courage to demand better treatment. Michael was struggling with his own internal conflict during this time. He'd grown up in a family where maintaining harmony was prioritized above addressing problems, where uncomfortable truths were swept under the rug in favor of keeping everyone comfortable. The idea of directly confronting his parents about their behavior was foreign and frightening to him. "I keep thinking there must be a way to fix this without anyone having to admit they were wrong," he said one evening as we sat in our living room, both of us emotionally drained from another difficult conversation about the situation. "Maybe, if we just give it some time, let things cool down, we can find a compromise that works for everyone." But I was beyond compromises that required me to accept less than I deserved. "Michael," I said gently but firmly, "some situations don't have comfortable solutions for everyone involved. Sometimes someone has to acknowledge wrongdoing, and sometimes relationships have to change in order to become healthier. I'm not going back to eating in the kitchen, literally or figuratively." The conversation that followed was one of the most honest we'd ever had about our marriage, our family dynamics, and our individual values. Michael admitted that he'd been aware of his family's treatment of me, but had hoped it would improve on its own over time. He'd been conflict avoidant, hoping that if he didn't acknowledge the problems, they would somehow resolve themselves. "I was a coward," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "I saw what was happening, and I chose to protect my own comfort rather than stand up for you." Lucas showed more backbone in one moment than I've shown in years of marriage. That admission was painful but necessary. It opened the door to deeper conversations about what we both wanted from our marriage, what kind of family we wanted to be, and what values we wanted to instill in our son. Michael began to understand that his silence in the face of my mistreatment had been a form of complicity, that neutrality in situations of injustice effectively supports the oppressor. The most difficult conversation came when Michael finally confronted his parents directly about their behavior. He'd been avoiding it for weeks, hoping the situation would resolve itself, but eventually he realized that his marriage and his integrity depended on having that discussion. He came home from that meeting looking emotionally devastated. "They don't see it," he said, slumping into his chair. "They genuinely believe they were being kind to you, that you misinterpreted their intentions, that you created a problem where none existed. Mom kept saying she's always treated you like family, and Dad said you were being ungrateful for everything they've done for us over the years." It was frustrating but not surprising. People who engage in subtle forms of mistreatment, often genuinely, don't recognize their behavior as problematic. They focus on their intentions rather than their impact, on their perception of their actions rather than how those actions are experienced by others. Patricia probably did believe she was being considerate when she sent me to eat in the kitchen, just as she probably believed she was being gracious when she accepted credit for my cooking. But the lack of recognition didn't change the impact of their behavior, and it certainly didn't obligate me to continue accepting it. Michael gradually came to understand this, though it was a painful process for him. He'd grown up believing his parents were fundamentally good people, and accepting that good people could engage in harmful behavior challenged his entire worldview. The holidays that year were different by necessity. Instead of the traditional Thompson family gathering, we spent Christmas morning at home, just the three of us, creating our own traditions and enjoying each other's company without the stress of navigating complex family dynamics. It was quiet and peaceful in a way our holidays hadn't been in years. We did visit both sets of grandparents during the Christmas season, but the visits were shorter and more structured. I was no longer the accommodating daughter-in-law who arrived early to help with preparations and stayed late to clean up. I was a guest who came for a reasonable amount of time, contributed appropriately to conversations and activities, and left when I was ready to go. The change in dynamic was palpable, and for some family members, uncomfortable. Patricia made several comments about how different things felt, how formal and distant our interactions had become. But I'd learned that discomfort with change isn't necessarily a sign that the change is wrong, especially when the previous comfort came at someone else's expense. Lucas thrived in this new environment. Without the stress of watching his mother be marginalized and dismissed, he was more relaxed. During family gatherings, more willing to engage in conversations, more confident in expressing his own opinions. He'd learned that his voice mattered, that standing up for what's right was valued in our family, and that truth was more important than politeness. Spring brought new developments as we settled into our redefined family relationships. Michael's extended family members had quietly taken sides, with a few offering support and understanding while others maintained their loyalty to Patricia's version of events. The family was effectively divided, not because I demanded anyone choose sides, but because my refusal to accept mistreatment had forced everyone to examine their own values and decide what they were willing to tolerate. My relationship with Michael's parents remained strained but civil. We attended family events when appropriate, but with clear boundaries about my role and expectations. I no longer volunteered to handle food preparations single-handedly, no longer accepted seating arrangements that excluded me from adult conversations, and no longer smiled politely when my contributions were minimized or attributed to others. This shift wasn't without its costs. Some family gatherings were tense, some conversations were stilted, and some traditions were modified or abandoned entirely. But the alternative, continuing to participate in dynamics that diminished my worth and taught my son that such treatment was acceptable, was no longer tolerable. Michael grew stronger throughout this process, learning to advocate for his wife and son, even when it meant disappointing his parents. He began to see that true family loyalty meant protecting all family members from mistreatment, not just maintaining surface harmony. When his mother made subtle digs about my sensitivity or demands for special treatment, he spoke up immediately, clearly stating that I deserved respect and that he wouldn't tolerate suggestions otherwise. One particularly significant moment came the following Thanksgiving, almost a year after the original incident. Patricia had called to invite us for dinner, and there was a carefully casual quality to her invitation that suggested she was trying to test whether we'd return to our former accommodating stance. "I was thinking of asking Emma to bring that wonderful stuffing of hers," she said to Michael. "Everyone always enjoys it so much, and she has such a talent for cooking." Michael's response was measured but clear. "If you'd like Emma to contribute to the meal, that's fine, but she'll be participating as a family member, not as kitchen help. That means she'll be involved in the meal planning, other people will handle other dishes, and she'll be seated at the main table with the rest of the adults." There was a long pause before Patricia responded, "Of course, dear."